Hi everybody. In this clip, we're going to start looking at our final revisions here just to kind of clean up and make our design look a little bit more polished. Now, one thing I want to point out is at any point during this process, we could take this piece and literally just take some screen grabs and toss it into Photoshop and start cleaning it up and making things look a lot more final and finished. That option always exists. Keep that in mind. At any point during this process, we've got some basic lighting, we've got some foundational work figured out. We know what some of the structure of this could be and still look like a sword. The fact of the matter is, at any point we could take this and toss this into Photoshop to do our final versions. You can cut this off at any point. If you wanted to take this further and get your design just a little bit more polished up in ZBrush, these are the kind of steps that we can do. So for example, for this piece here, I think I want to start now taking this into Dynamesh so that I can get something a little bit more refined and final. So for example here, I'm just going to turn on Dynamesh because that's going to work for me. And I could even go a little bit higher resolution on this, but one thing I do want to do is you'll notice that this edge is still a little bit sharp and jagged. So in our Dynamesh settings, we can find here, Dynamesh, there's also an option called Polish. Now this one is really good because if I start to work with this in any way, when I do this again, what it's going to do is actually polish and clean up those edges. Makes the geometry a little bit less usable than it was before, but it's really nice to work with when you want to kind of get some clean shapes to work with and then build them out a little bit more. So for example, if I just kind of clean up some of these edges here with some H polish and start to, if I hold Alt, H polish will actually push up a little bit as well. Then when I do this again, that becomes a nice clean piece of geometry. So this is incredibly useful when you're trying to block in some big ideas. So then I can just Dynamesh again and it'll kind of clean up those entire sections here. And so I'm using a lot of my trim dynamic because it's going to create some shapes that are really going to work nicely in here. Trim dynamic really works well for beveling certain sections, kind of giving that tapering effect, and H polish refines that effect further. And I'll usually hold Alt to kind of push both back. There we go. Certain sections may not exist the way that you'd like them to. So again, all you just got to do is either mask them out on your own and just pull them out with your move brush. Because again, we're just going to Dynamesh again, so it'll clean it up. And we've got something to work with here. So that's fine. Let's just taper this as well, because I think that'll be really useful in these sections. And H polish to kind of clean up some of these sections in here. There we go. That's pretty good. I think I might want to use my transpose tool to just kind of pull some of that down. Same in here, just to taper that off a little bit more. And to use H polish to just kind of clean up some of those sections. There we go. Again, in this case, I'm just trying to create some nice clean shapes so that everything looks really refined. And I'll use mirror and weld to just kind of copy that over to both sides. I can clean up this interior section, or I can just paint it over in Photoshop. I'm not too concerned about it here. Let's pull that out a little bit in here. Oh, I got to make sure that my symmetry is turned on both sides. There we go. So that is the kind of stuff that I can work with in here, just kind of polishing some of these sections out, cleaning them up. A lot of this is me trying to refine and figure out what the shape of this should be, what shapes look good and flow together really nicely. So this section in here, for example, again, I'm just going to turn on polish right away and Dynamesh that. So let's turn on Dynamesh. Let's make sure that's turned on. Oh, mask must be cleared, as you can see up here if it's not working. Just I must have had a mask turned on, I think, for this bottom section. Dynamesh that, and we get something pretty clean right away, which is pretty decent. And again, I can just H polish both sides of this to really just hammer in the clarity of this form. Dynamesh that again. If I want to go a little bit higher resolution here to get some nice clean cuts, I'll do that as well. So just clean that up, H polish, there we go. Let's go in here. Again, this geometry inside doesn't really matter because we're not going to see it. We're not really working with it. And we're not trying to make a perfect model. We're just trying to sell an idea with a lot of clarity. There we go. That's pretty good. And we can just use our transpose again to kind of pull that out into a space that's going to be a little bit more accessible for us. So that's pretty neat. It's creating some shapes that I like, creating some elements that I would like to work with. Up here, that's working pretty good, but we could turn on that H polish again, up that resolution a little bit. There we go. And immediately that's starting to create some nice clean geometry for us. So things look nice and sharp and crisp. One thing I do want to do here is start to deal with this sort of killing edge that's supposed to exist on my blade. Now, for one, some of these edges are just getting a little bit too wobbly as I'm going through them. Hard to work with. What I want to do, I'm going to press A, and now I can open this up. So I've got Lazy Mouse. I've talked about this a few times. Works really well here. So the steps are the number of times it's going to apply my brush, which we want to just be a very low amount. And the lazy radius is basically going to be that little distance that we see here, that little red line. So if I just increase this distance a whole bunch, then basically what's going to happen is my H polish, or my trim dynamic in this case, is going to happen only when I hit that threshold, which works really nicely here. I'm also going to turn up that smooth because the smooth will basically just take any of my brush strokes and kind of smooth out the resulting action that I'm doing. And I can also hold shift for this to just kind of increase the distance of that edge there. So in this situation, I now get something that's going to look real nice and crisp here. And I can kind of polish that out a little bit more on both sides just to refine this in a little bit more. And again, I'll do the same on the opposite side, although again, I don't really need to if I'm not going to show too much of the concept from this side. There we go, that's pretty good. I can kind of clean that up in there. If I want to figure out what's going on in that killing edge, again, I can figure that out in my Photoshop. I can figure that out basically anywhere else. But I do want to make sure that this looks like a blade. I kind of want to figure out what's going on in those sections. You can always refine this further by just kind of going in and really figuring out what those details are. You know, just refining some of the position of some of these elements is worthwhile. I'm going to take the Dynamesh resolution and just go up a little bit more on it and use polish. There we go, just to really get some clean results from this. And we'll just kind of go through here with that trim dynamic. And again, that lazy mouse means that I get some real good results from where that edge goes. So it's not going to get too loose and fake looking and sketchy looking, which is sometimes what I want to avoid in these situations. There we go. Just go across that edge a few times, make that look nice and clean. And again, I can just H polish on top of that to just refine and clean up any of these sections that look a little bit too loose. Let's just take this section in here as well. And I do want to push this back in, but I want to make sure that backface mask is turned on so that as I remove the information here, I'm not really getting rid of anything else. So I could take this, that's pretty good. Take this section, also push that back, and start to refine this part here, because I do want to make sure that this looks nice and clean as well. So I want to polish this out so that the back of the blade has an interesting kind of quality to it too, and possibly bring the base of this up a bit more. Oh, let's make sure that our symmetry is turned on here. There we go. Because this is something that's actually very common for these kinds of objects. There we go. Let's actually just use our cut brush through this section. That'll be pretty good. There we go. So now we got some interesting elements here where part of the handle builds into the bottom. And in fact, this handle, I think, can use some work as well. So let's, again, Dynamesh. Let's increase that resolution. That's pretty good here. What I want to do is H polish this out quite a bit more. So let's turn on our symmetry, our Z-axis stuff here, so that we can start to make something that's a little bit more appropriate for the shape here, which would be some tapering going on. And if I don't get the shape quite right, I can always clip curve this section here and just pull it down with my transpose by holding Alt. So again, just so you see here, basically just picking this section and holding Alt, which will push this whole section down from a very short distance. There we go. So now I look like I get a nice clean shape out of that section there. So that's pretty good. I'm going to take this section as well. I think there's a piece here that I could use if I just duplicate this and drag it down towards the base here. I'm going to mirror it on the y-axis so it's flipped and pull it out into this section here, pull it down a bunch think that'll work pretty decently. Just going to rotate this in and pull it into something like this, because I think I'd like to use this piece a little bit more. There we go. Pull that down. I think that that could fit quite nicely in here if I just kind of massage some of that shape a little bit more. Let's turn off our lazy mouse for our trim dynamic and start to just kind of block that in a bit more here. So if we just kind of cut that in, get a sharp line, and H-polish in some of these details here, I think that'll be pretty neat. And then basically just kind of trim away at certain sections here. Again, I'm going to go into isolation mode so that I can trim away at flat surfaces, which I think will work a little bit more decently there. And that's pretty cool. That's a nice shape that we can create there, which we could duplicate on the other side as well with a mirror and weld. Perfect. And in this case, I'll also rotate it in with my transpose, with symmetry turned on on both sides, so that it goes nice and clean in here. Perfect. So now we've got a pretty interesting shape built in, and our last steps will be to make sure that we've got something that we can put into Photoshop so that we can create a more final, proper concept.